coming out of Sports Illustrated, coming out of Virginia, the Virginia governor signs NIL law that could significantly change the college football landscape. The reason this is important is because of the, and it's because there's this brouhaha between schools, the NCAA, and NIL in general, which I actually learned something here in this article because I, first of all, what we have is according to this Virginia law. So, Virginia Governor Youngkin, according to this law, effective July 1st, schools in Virginia can directly pay student athletes for name, image, and likeness, and it will be illegal for the NCAA to punish a school for compensating athletes for their NIL. Currently, the NCAA prohibits schools from signing NIL deals with their own student athletes. This has led to the creation of NIL collectives, which are separate entities from the schools themselves that pay players for their NIL. So, our famous example right now is the NIL packages going on at Ohio State, where they actually got $13 million together. Michigan is famously behind in NIL, but it sounds like they're going to be able to pick that up this year. The kicker is that last December, NCAA President Charlie Baker proposed potential rules stipulating that all schools should be able to pay athletes via NIL deals as part of a plan to update NIL policies. That's the part that was news to me, that they wanted the schools to be able to pay the athletes, because I thought that it was the schools that were not wanting to do that, which actually is true here. In order for any rule changes to take effect, voting members of Division One athletics need to vote on the measure. So this is where the schools are actually working against what the NCAA is trying to put in place with regard to NIL. Dan Murphy over there on X said why they're worried it gets too close to employment. So why are schools hesitant to do this? It's because they're worried it gets too close to employment and will be used against them in the federal or NLRB cases. Northwestern, was it Northwestern last year where the guys tried to start a union?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, so I think that comes into play here. The VA law, the Virginia law, explicitly says athletes aren't employees, but that won't stop attorneys from saying the schools are just playing semantics games to avoid employment. So here we are. The NIL situation just gets crazier and crazier. The NCAA actually wants schools to be able to pay players. The schools are hesitant to play players because they'll end up being employees. The Virginia law says they can't be employees, but that's not going to stop lawyers from coming out of the woodwork.
I guess I'm a little confused. So the Virginia law explicitly says athletes are not employees, but that won't stop attorneys from saying the schools are just playing semantic games to avoid employment.
Mhm.
It's the law that says that they're not employees, not the schools.
But laws have to be interpreted, and
But
lawyers
they're
interpret the law.
but they're not interpreting the law. They're interpreting the source of the law. And the
Well,
source
okay,
is not the school. The source is
keep in mind this is a summary.
well,
So
okay,
he's
yeah.
not quoting the law. He's not quoting verbatim the points in the law. He is summarizing and saying that the law explicitly says athletes aren't employees. Lawyers are going to come along and say, it doesn't explicitly say. It kind of says that. And in this case, A and B are true and X and Z are not. That's how lawyers do that.
But Dan Murphy is saying that the law explicitly says that they're not employees.
Right, but he's not quoting the law here. If he were quoting the law, if he had the point here that said this is what the law says, then yeah, that might put an end to it. But lawyers being lawyers, lawyers interpret the law. They can look at this and they can interpret it a different way. That's how precedents get set. That's why you have the Second Amendment is a law, but it's being reinterpreted in multiple ways.
So essentially what this does is it's a domino then. It's just the first domino. It's the first domino that eventually leads to schools having to accept that the athletes are employees. Because look, I mean, I've
Mhm.
got my thoughts on whether or not the schools are paying their players or are too involved with NIL. I can get into that in a second. But what doesn't make sense to me is if this law was meant to make anything a little bit more black and white, it absolutely failed, in my opinion.
It sometimes it does. It's at the very least, it's a shot at the NCAA. Actually, it's not even just a
The-
shot at the NCAA. It's a shot at the NCAA and at the schools that won't pay their athletes. because the Virginia governor here, Governor Youngkin, is saying, "Oh, we've got this figured out. Schools can pay the athletes. The NCAA can't do anything about it, and they're also not employees." Now, if the
Okay.
lawyers come along and look at that law and start picking it apart and finding loopholes, well, then that's life. That's what happens. Is what they're doing, is that the right way to go, or were you about to get into that?
Well, I think I'm gonna read a couple of paragraphs here from another article I found on it to see if I can make some sense of it. But I don't think this is a good way to go. I think that the end result is actually going to be the opposite of what this law intended, if I'm understanding it correctly. So, okay, so
All right.
this is from ESPN. The law explicitly states that athletes should not be considered employees of their school. Schools in Virginia are still not allowed to pay athletes for their performance in sport, but starting this summer, they will be able to use university or athletic department funds to pay athletes for appearing in marketing campaigns. They're not employees per se, they're just spokespeople. Williams said this was maybe a distinction without a difference, but there's a distinction there. Okay, and then somebody said, or somebody named Babcock says Virginia Tech is considering a number of methods for how it might deploy school funds in the future. Options could include contracting with third parties such as a marketing agency or a booster collective to pay the athletes instead of cutting a check directly from the athletic department. He said the new law puts Virginia schools in a good position for both the current NIL marketplace as well as other forms of payment that we think we see around the corner. I don't see how this ends with without the students eventually just becoming named employees. I don't understand
Hmm.
this.
Well,
Okay, so
and so right there, as you're reading that, that's what the lawyers are going to pick up on.
yeah, because okay, so maybe this is a distinction without a difference, but there's a distinction there.
Hmm.
I don't think there is. So what I'm thinking this law ends up doing is saying like, yeah, the schools can pay the players, but they're totally not employees. They're totally not. Okay, it's not the same thing. This isn't the same thing. Well, in functionality, it is the same thing. No, it's not. It's not because you see they signed a contract. They're a third party. They're a third party. They're separate. Okay, it's totally not the same thing. Yeah, but he's working for him. But it's not an employee. He's not. It's not. No, it's not the same thing. I, in
Yeah,
functionally speaking, yeah, it is though. He's basically an
right.
employee.
It's a tricky situation, and I'm really curious to see how this plays out. There's a company near here where I live that tried to have all of their workers be contractors. Unfortunately, it's a lawn care company, so he had trucks and equipment that had to be run by authorized employees. The IRS came down on him, not the federal IRS came down on him and said, you need to pay these guys as employees, not as contractors. And he's like, no, 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 they're contractors. And it was, well, who's maintaining all of these trucks and that kind of thing. There's a real gray area there between contractors and employees, and then whatever it is that Youngkin is trying to do here. From my standpoint, I think there's merit to this. I think this could work. I think Youngkin is onto something here. How it plays out is going to be tricky, but I can see how for an athlete. So let's say because they said you still have to talk to the NIL collective. So the NIL collective is separate from the school. I don't know exactly how all of it ties together, but let's say you're recruited by a school and you've been told, "Oh, we've got NIL money." But you can't get the NIL money until you're at the school, and you're not going to go to the school until you're sure of the NIL money. There's that disconnect of, okay,
Yeah.
you've got to take a risk. And maybe it's not as much of a risk as I think it is, but it seems like there is definitely a risk there. I think given the environment, students could get used and played basically. So what this would do was
Yeah.
say, okay, not only okay, so here's your scholarship, here's your NIL package, and here's your enrollment package, all in one shot. Boom, done. What do you
But
think?
they're not employees,
But
and
they're not employees. Yeah, I don't know how that works.
that's okay. So I'm actually thinking maybe this works. They negotiated a deal basically saying, look, the schools don't want the players to be employees because then they're on the hook for everything, like benefits and salaries and stuff like that.
Mhm.
But the players want to get paid. This might be a nice little middle ground. My problem is that this gives the players and the schools a little bit too much leeway in terms of being able to guarantee NIL packages to recruits to essentially confirm pay for play. Maybe they're saying, look, we'll give you a contract, we will say that you can be a contractor for the school. You're not an employee, so the school is not on the hook for all these extra benefits and stuff like that. You can be a contractor. But then the players get a taste of contract life and they say, well, where are my benefits? Well, I want more money, et cetera, et cetera. And then they start unionizing
Hmm.
and unionizing. And I don't want to get political, whether you feel one way or the other about unions. I don't think that that's going to result in the players getting exactly what they want. Eventually what ends up happening is that the players or the players agencies or the collectives, or not the collectives, but the when they start unionizing and negotiating, they're going to start asking for things that eventually, or that the schools and the NCAA can't provide. You see this all the time, I think, with the car companies, is that the unions end up, like, the unions try to negotiate for salaries and other types of things that the car companies literally cannot pay for, and then the employees just aren't working. So what's going to happen is one day in fall, the unions and the schools are going to all be negotiating, or the unions and the NCAA or the conferences are all going to be negotiating. Negotiations are going to fall through, and it's going to be all over the news. If a deal is not reached by midnight on September the 10th, then week 3 games are off.
Sam Hartman's looking downfield for AJ Barter.
Oh, Carter
Oh!
almost has a one-handed catch.
Almost. That was